This is Dan Corder talking about how white South Africans got so wealthy. Please follow him on TikTok at Dan Corder.
Black economic empowerment is nothing compared to white economic empowerment. And it freaks me out a little bit how many South Africans complain about BEE, or they say things like 30 years of democracy, hasn't it been enough for you? And how few South Africans know how far colonial and apartheid governments went to advantage white people. For hundreds of years. You know that talking about colonization and apartheid gets complicated because so much of it happened off the record, or maybe there's not evidence and people dispute it. So I'm going to make this super simple. All I'm going to do is tell you about a handful of government policies that were enacted on the record, no doubt, to advantage white people. White economic empowerment, it's just what it was. There's honestly too much to talk about in 3 minutes, so I'm just going to start at 1910 when the Union of South Africa was first formed. The Second South African War was fought between the Brits and the Boers, and the Brits won, but then this new country was formed and they wanted to unite all white people together. Immediately, nearly all people of color aren't allowed to vote. And then in 1913, the Land Act made it illegal for black people to own or even lease land outside of reserves. That meant 93% of the land could only be owned by white people. So who did it benefit? White farmers. Then in the early 1920s, poor white Afrikaners protested that most of big industry was owned by British companies, and those companies were hiring skilled black laborers over white laborers. In response, the government funded massive public works programs like building the Hartbeespoort Dam to create jobs for white workers. In 1924, the National Party came to power for the first time, and they immediately increased subsidies for white farmers and placed high tariffs on imported agricultural goods to give local farmers the advantage. Also in 1925, the Wage Act creates a minimum wage for white workers but not black workers, and the government offers incentives to companies who are applying for tenders. The more white people you employ, the more likely you are to get work. Let's jump forward to 1948 when the National Party returns to power and they formalize apartheid for the first time. And the first thing they did was direct massive funding towards social grants and welfare programs for poor white people and slashed funding for people of color. The state continually expanded education programs to upskill white workers while denying all of that to black people. In 1960, the apartheid state cut all funding for feeding schemes in black schools. The 1952 Urban Areas Act made it incredibly hard for black people to seek employment. In 1953, the Industrial Conciliation Act meant black people couldn't be classified as employees. They got no benefits, they couldn't unionize. In the 1950s and 60s, black people's pensions were fixed, which meant, with inflation, that those pensions were losing value. The Nats worked incredibly hard to help Afrikaner-owned business. In the 1960s, the apartheid government created African language radio stations and handed out hundreds of thousands, millions of radios to black people in townships. And then they gave advertising space to this massive new audience they'd created to Afrikaner-owned businesses. I've run out of time, but there's literally so much more like this. So before your next hot take on 30 years of democracy or BEE, exercise your reading skills and face some facts.
Dan Corder dropping jewels again.
South Africa is not ready for a white president. You know, sometimes a headline is so obvious that you think, why did they waste ink and paper on this? Like the Amazon rainforest is in trouble. Because duh. Obviously, who even took the time to say this incredibly obvious thing? Ah, yes, that makes sense. Die Vryheidsfront Plus. This quote actually annoys me so much because it kind of implies that South Africans who aren't ready to trust a white president are being unreasonable or should change. Let's have a quick reminder of what life was like for most South Africans after the last white president. I have to whisper because there are people around. In 1996, the first ever true national census was taken where every single South African was quizzed on what their life is like. It's a crystal clear picture of how the apartheid government made life good for white people and denied any quality of life to people of color. In 1996, 21% of all people of color lived in informal housing. That's 6 million people. 0.1% of white people lived in informal housing. This was after over 3 million people were evicted from their homes during apartheid. 25% of black people had no access to running water in 1996. That's 7 million people. Meanwhile, 97% of white people had access to piped water. 65% of black South Africans had no access to flush or chemical toilets in 1996. That's more than 20 million people. 99.6% of white people had access to flush and chemical toilets. 56% of black South Africans had no access to electricity in 1996. That's more than 17 million people. 99.6% of white South Africans had access to electricity. 59% of black South Africans had no access to refuse removal, like waste. That's more than 18 million people. And 92% of white South Africans had access to regular refuse removal. This was less than 30 years ago. Born frees were born when this was the reality. And this came after hundreds of years of white people abusing and exploiting people of color. So yeah, duh. And now what? You want trust? You want forgive and forget? That show is cancelled. Trust is earned. And I would say it's pretty damn reasonable to wait a little while longer before seeing if that trust is deserved.
White South Africans coming for Dan Quarter.
You're a traitor. You must be stripped of your whiteness. This was the first time I was called a race traitor. I directed a film called Leicester that made news headlines worldwide. I directed the film for Open Stellenbosch, which was an epic student organization at Stellenbosch University who was trying to expose racism and linguistic exclusion at the institution. The film went viral, it became a news story all around the world. But suddenly, some white people accused me of being a race traitor. And this energy happens on TikTok a lot too. Crazy how you're always trying to expose the DA. How much are you being paid? Propaganda, propaganda, propaganda. EFF ANC agent. Even though I obviously make videos about everybody I take issue with. Government behavior, government behavior, government behavior. I think all this behavior shows a few things. Firstly, it exposes such a horrible us versus them racist mentality. Like, if you're a white person, you just shouldn't ever criticize white people or white organizations because then you're basically fighting for the other team. And that's so racist and so depressing. And the second thing that it reminds me of is that the scariest thing to a white supremacist or a racist is not people of color. The scariest thing is white people who disagree with them. Because they know that we live in a country where people are just more likely to listen to people of the same skin color as them. And so if a white person starts to criticize their side, maybe other white people will listen to them instead of the white supremacist bigots. And this happens with everyone. I see black people who criticize the ANC or the EFF sometimes being ripped to shreds by people saying, "How dare you tear down our side," when the enemy is their side. And it just kind of sucks. Because we should be trying to move towards a country where people can have real conversations, talk about what they really think, engage in critical ideas. But instead, people try to shut down these important conversations and silence voices by continuing the same old, tired, us versus them racist nonsense.
This is Bianca at Bianca Says Too, exposing pro-Zionists in South Africa. Please follow her on TikTok.
That was wild for me. So I was watching the video this morning. So the background is that the Democratic Alliance's City of Cape Town issued a notice to a mosque in Parkwood to remove their Palestinian flag murals because it is a distraction to traffic on the M5. But here is the video.
We are at Masjid al-Sabr in Parkwood. I've just been informed by one of the members of the committee here that the masjid has got a notice from the City of Cape Town to remove this painting. As you can see, it's this painting and the painting around the corner here, which, in my experience, has no bearing on the traffic. The M5. As you can see, the M5. Apparently, the city says that this is a distraction to the traffic and it's undesirable. So, if this is undesirable, why is gangsters' slogans on walls not undesirable? Why does the city not remove the undesirable post on walls done by gangsters, which is antisocial and against the morals of our society? So I want to know from the city, is it that you are pro-Israel, that you are pro-Zionist, you are pro the atrocities that goes against the people of Palestine, that you cannot afford, that you can ill afford us to express ourselves? By you sending us a notice, you are actually telling us, you are impeding on our rights. You are telling us that we have no right to express ourselves. And this is a freedom of our expression.
At Bianca Says Too, exposing pro-Zionists again.
So there are a number of people that make the argument that if the Democratic Alliance was the governing party, they would bring back apartheid. Okay. I personally don't engage too much with that particular conversation for two reasons. Not because I don't think they would if they could, but also simply because I don't enjoy the gaslighting and stuff that comes from the pro-DA crowd. You know, look at this policy, they're non-racial, they got black people in, look at what they've done for black people. It's like a entire thing. And it's very difficult to actually demonstrate evidence. You know, this is the particular issue. And it's exhausting too. And I don't like wasting my time on those kind of things. There's bigger issues to deal with. However, I can say that they follow the apartheid propaganda communication strategy. In other words, the propaganda push. The Democratic Alliance does a playbook, repeating lies, making up huge, shocking numbers, and not being able to actually justify those numbers, that kind of thing. Okay, so they do that, and that I can demonstrate. And then there is now currently the inability to call out genocidal conduct by Israel, who is accused of implementing an apartheid state and therefore supporting Israel and attacking the government for actually taking Israel on for their genocidal conduct. So there's that too. And then there's this, the Western Cape government. So I'm going to stop there. Mainstream media does this continuously, and I'm going to call it out. If this was, for instance, Gauteng province, then it would have said ANC is condemned. But now, because it is the Democratic Alliance and it's the Western Cape, Democratic Alliance is not mentioned here. So Western Cape, i.e. Democratic Alliance, condemned for promoting Dr. Death events. Now, Dr. Death is Wouter Besson, who is living his best life as a cardiologist. So they advertised this on their official Western Cape government Facebook page. It's down now. A talk by Wouter Besson, dubbed Dr. Death, in the Hasuka in February was advertised on the Western Cape government's Facebook page and has left it fumbling and opposition parties fuming. Do you see how the Democratic Alliance is not mentioned here? Besson, the former head of the country's secret chemical and biological warfare project during apartheid, was invited by the Riversdale Landbougenootskap to speak at a function next month. The public can attend Besson's talk at a cost of just 220 Rand, and that includes breakfast, folks. Breakfast with a murderer. However, the organizers of the talk, called Manne Kuier, Men Visit, were unable to tell News 24 what Besson would be talking about. So maybe Dr. Besson would tell us about the chemical warfare. He could perhaps tell us about the hundreds of soldiers that were drugged and then pushed out of aircrafts over the sea, murders, I don't know. Or perhaps it would all be about weathering the storm and a story of redemption. But here's the thing. Democratic Alliance is no longer able to hide. They simply don't know how to read the room. They've put this thing out there. They've fumbled the ball. Obviously, they've taken it down now. But yeah, know your DA. Remember, elections are around the corner.
At Bianca Says Too, exposing the fake farm murders narrative in South Africa.
I've said this a number of times, but I have a huge problem with these so-called farm murder, farm attack activists, because I believe that they actually stand in the way of getting justice. They also push a racist narrative in this country, and then we don't address crime, specifically in this case, rural crime, like we should. And people don't get behind it because of the racist narrative. And an example is this. A farm murder took place on 30 November 2021. A young farmer from Lindley near Steynsrus in the Free State province of South Africa, Christian van Tonder, 29, was shot dead by an unknown number of attackers. The young farmer's body was found in the barrage area outside Van der Bijl Park in the Gauteng province. He was found in his bakkie with a gunshot wound. So now you had a whole lot of white genocide groups that jumped onto this. You had another group that's called Uncut South Africa. If you look in the comment sections on Facebook, it is just they're killing our people and things like that. And The alleged murderer has now been charged. So now the headline's got nothing to do with farm attacks and this young farmer being killed. Now it's just cattle purchase turns fatal. Vanderbijl Park man faces murder charge. The Vanderbijl Park man appeared in court for allegedly killing a seller. Now he's no longer a farmer. After an arranged cattle purchase. Frederick Pieter Jacobus Botha, 42, is accused of murdering Christian van Tonder on 29 November 2021. You see how the language has even changed. Now it's not a farm murder or farm attack. It's also not young farmer murdered. So on 29 August 2023, the police arrested Botha following investigations. He faced murder and stock theft charges in the Vanderbijl Park court. Botha was held in police custody after his court appearance, and the NPA stated the case would resume on September the 4th for bail. So what happened in this case is that Botha allegedly took Van Tonder to settle payments after the cattle purchase, and it was over 200,000 rand. They reportedly drove to a remote area near Theouville Plots Barrage, where Botha allegedly shot and killed Van Tonder. One would think that these farm murder activists would be very excited by the fact that someone has been arrested in this case. I mean, it is the murder of a young farmer. He was a stock farmer. In fact, there were entire articles on how a Free State farmers mourn for young food producer, and this is Christian van Tonder. So I guess we're all holding our breath for AfriForum to congratulate the South African Police Service for arresting the murderer of a young farmer, because I know that that is their flagship project, farm murders and farm attacks. So I suppose we'll wait, but I know that they're currently focusing on a struggle song.
At Bianca Says Too, schooling white racist South Africans.
No, Pete. Who's lying to you guys? Okay, so I'm going to now educate you, and I'm telling you, AfriForum better start paying me, because I can't believe that one organization has so many uneducated people. I mean, surely, if you are paying money to an organization, you're paying money to send these men on top star trips overseas. Surely you should ask questions. Okay, so now let me help you. So firstly, the UN is not asking anything about white Afrikaners in South Africa, okay? AfriForum fought to be part of a group of organizations across the world that can actually give feedback into the UN, okay? So it's non-governmental organizations, and AfriForum happens to be one of them. Since it's been one of them, it goes to its meetings. You guys who pay fees actually pay for these trips overseas, and they don't just go to this meeting, because I kind of think that AfriForum knows that, yeah, what they say can be checked. I mean, the other representatives from South Africa don't even rock up to argue against AfriForum, is my understanding. So, and if I look at that report, the persecution of minorities that AfriForum puts together and goes and delivers at the UN, I can't see much happening there, because it's quite a crappy report. I could have done better. You should get them to call me. And you can see it's kind of a PR exercise. It's the same as going to Hungary, and it's the same as when they go to the USA. You guys pay for it, but have you actually ever asked what is coming out of it? What value does it have to the 300,000 members of AfriForum that pays on a monthly basis, or those that donate to things? Have you ever asked? Or is it just that you kind of see these smarter people than you doing these smart things that you'll never be able to do, and you think, oh, no, I'm going to pay for this. I'm not going to question anything. It's kind of weird for me. So again, the United Nations isn't asking about the so-called persecuted minorities in South Africa. Another thing is, Arends van Zyl is representing you guys. Arends Roots, I think, is a little bit smarter than Arends van Zyl, but, let's see. You guys kind of circulate the same kind of talent all the time. So we wish him well on his endeavors. But I've also seen the list of things that he's going to discuss. I mean, the one thing was proven blatantly false. And that's related to the so-called white farmers can't export rubbish. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if someone is going to contest. Personally, I should actually find out if they shouldn't send me, because I can actually break down every single argument in that report. Could have also written a better report, as I say. So yeah, it's a waste of money. But yeah, you guys keep on paying money. I see, though, you must be paying pretty good salaries to these guys, because here's the head of AfriForum at the Grand Prix, and I'm loving it for them. I think that fools should be separated from their money. Anyway, I hope that helps, Pete.